All right, welcome to this episode of First Home Hustle. I'm Kim McCarty.
And I'm Dave Stahl.
All right, today we're going to talk about supply, demand, and then a little bit maybe on, do we get wrapped up in the price, or should we look at more about the value and what it does in our payment? So we kind of have two different areas to explore.
Okay.
So let's talk about supply and demand first. So lately, I have been having conversations with many buyers and telling them your best time to buy is now. And the reason it's now is the supply is really low, but our demand is a little bit lower, right? So that helps them as they are trying to get builders incentives or sellers to pay closing costs. And as the demand increases and the supply either stays the same and the demand goes up, well, what happens?
Right. Well, I think this is a lot the same number we talked about when prices go up and rates go down, or
Right.
prices come down and rates go up.
Absolutely.
It's that same supply and demand curve that when the supply is down,
Right.
i.e. demand up, all these incentives with builders and people wanting to give you closing costs goes away because the next person coming to look at the house doesn't need it.
Exactly. Well, and especially as first-time home buyers, many of us know that we don't have a lot of cash, right? And so when you get into that multiple offer situation, you may not have the ability to either over offer full price or have the cash to back up your over offer price. So I think that when you're looking at the supply and demand, for me, when I'm looking at a first-time home buyer or any buyer that is maybe limited on budget, limited on cash resources, I would love for them to get under contract and under or done with that process by March, really, before that spring season kicks off. Because as that spring season kicks off and more people jump into the market, then that puts them at a disadvantage.
Right, when there's less demand.
When there's less demand, supply, demand. When there's less demand, for sure. But we kind of saw this with one of our buyers that we are currently working with. Like, we started looking at properties and her budget was up to 400. Like, she didn't want to go above 400 because she was looking at what the monthly payment would be. But everything that we looked at in that budget of 400 just was not checking her boxes, mainly because there was so much work that needed to be done. And she had a very small window of where she wanted to be. So what I did is I called you and I said, listen, what happens if I increase her to a purchase price of $430? I want to do the numbers on that. So kind of explain what we did when we looked at those numbers.
Well, I think what we did is we looked at the big picture of affordability, right? So we talk about down payment, closing cost, and then after closing costs.
Right.
And that's really where this one landed was, all of the properties that you looked at before, there is going to be after closing cost.
Immediate after closing cost, right? Not just maybe down in the future, we don't like the paint color. No, this was like, hey, that AC's on its last leg. Everything was kind of dilapidated.
What we did is you said, okay, now let's look at something that's not 400. Let's look at something that's 430, 435. What's that difference in payment?
Right.
And then we kind of compare that to, okay, so we've got $100, $150 difference in payment, but at the end of the day, we're not bringing another $30,000 to do renovations right after we close.
So I think that it's really important to focus on that $150 difference in payment. Like, when you bring it down to that, we're talking a $30,000 difference in price.
And that number might be slightly off. I'm just pulling it out. I mean, it could be 200.
It was 200. I think it was closer to 200. But still, when $200 for $30,000, that takes you from a totally different looking house, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, it took us from a house that we immediately were going to have to do work on. Like, we couldn't move in, right? The carpets were that bad, you couldn't move in it. To the point where now I have a house that visually, like, we'll do the inspections next week, but visually, the ACs have been replaced. The roof has been replaced. The hot water heater has been replaced. So some of those bigger ticket items have already been done. The flooring is completely new. So for her, it really came down to the price. So we talked about that. And before even called her, you and I had already had the conversation. What is it going to do from 400 to 430 on a monthly payment for her? And so we had broken that down. When I called her, I basically said, here's what it's going to cost. I said, hear me out, right? Because she was like, oh, that's way higher than I want to go. It is, but hear me out. If we do this, this, and this is where your payment is versus this is where your payment is. $200 a month. The very first question I asked her, is there $200 worth of things in your life right now that you could forego until you get used to this new payment?
Well, and then the follow-up question to that is, if we go back to the other houses you were looking at, how long is it going to take you to get 35,000 to do the renovations that you actually have to do now
Right.
to be in the spot where you need to be?
Well, and I even told her, I said, listen, we're even if you don't talk about cosmetics, right? And you're willing to live on the carpet and you're willing to live on with it all. That AC goes out that first summer, and we're in Texas. It's 110 degrees. You don't have a choice. Like, you have to find a way to get a new AC unit or
Right.
Band-Aid it along, right? So there are some things that just are not negotiable. You have to get them done. The other thing we were able to do by going to that higher price point, we were able to then turn around and get closing cost assistance. So by doing that, we had that conversation, and you educated her like, okay, even though your price is going up this much, if we go back and ask for this much, so why don't you kind of talk about how we backed into the closing cost to get her
Well, and
comfortable?
this comes back to the demand issue too, right?
Right,
So
for sure.
right now we
I
lowered
can do this, right?
lower demand and we're able to negotiate that.
Right.
As the demand goes up, this ability to negotiate goes away.
Absolutely.
So what we talked about was going from, offering a little bit less and, basically just asking.
Right.
Because if you don't ask questions, the answer is automatically no, right?
Right.
And that's really what I told her, because she
Yeah.
was like, well, I'm worried about, offending the seller. At the end of the day, it's a business transaction. Nobody's going to be offended. You put something out there, they say yes or no, and that's where the negotiation starts.
Absolutely.
Right? So we started from, all right, if they do 420
Mm-hmm.
and give you the closing cost, this is what it looks like. And we kind of ratcheted up $5,000 at a time.
Right.
So, in your conversation with her, you guys decided to go, 425 and ask for
15.
Ask for 15 so that they could do a 2-1 buy down.
Right.
That way rates lower for the first year, lower second year, normal rate third year.
Right.
Hopefully at that point
Refinance
we're
at
able
that
to
point.
refi.
Right.
But it put it in a perspective where, all we're really bringing to closing is, our earnest money and down payment,
Right.
instead of having to bring earnest money, down payment,
And
then
closing costs.
and closing cost, and later have to do the renovations.
Exactly.
So now we're in a spot where, yes, the payment might be a little bit higher than what they wanted to begin with,
Right.
but overall
Their monthly out of pocket
right
is going to be a lot less for
Right.
sure. Yeah,
right
for sure. And she was willing to listen. And that's what I love about, I happened to be showing her houses when you called. And so I got to hear what you were telling her. And then that way I could just reiterate the point again as we were continuing to look at houses. The beauty of it is her husband was very easy to convince that this is the road we needed to go on. She's more of the number cruncher, the bean counter. And so she was a little more, reserved about
I think
that.
he was going to be the labor doing the repairs.
Yeah, for sure. And he knew the prices. Like he came in and he said, this is going to cost us X amount. And he only has 2 days off a week, and so they have a family. And that's the other thing you have to consider, what's important with your weekends. Do you want to spend it, renovating a house with money that you really don't have to renovate?
Right.
That's the other thing. You really got to think about your time and what's important.
Right.
For sure.
Well, I think the biggest point out of this whole conversation that we're having is that we are right now in a spot where, yes, demand's creeping up.
Yes.
And if somebody's looking to buy a house and try to get things negotiated, the best time to do it is when demand is lower instead of when it's higher, because the things that you got negotiated wouldn't have been negotiated, a year and a half, 2 years
And
ago.
it probably won't get negotiated in 2 months.
Right.
That deal is gone in 2 months. The other thing that I think is important to point out is that any inventory that's currently sitting on the market that maybe has been sitting a while, that's when we get these opportunities, right? Because it's been sitting 30 days. Well, as new inventory starts to come on the market, we've already seen all the
Hmm.
old inventory. So now we're just like everybody else going to see the new stuff. And that new stuff might be nicer than the old stuff that's been sitting on the market that we've already seen and already vetoed. And now we're in a situation where maybe there's 10 buyers now looking at the exact same property. And we know that it's the best thing out there because we've seen everything. And now we're in a situation where we're competing. And that's what I explained to her, is that there's not going to be a better time for you. And they also have their apartment that they're actually, having to break that lease on, and they are paying a little bit to get out of that lease. But when you look at how much they're saving by doing that, it was kind of that no-brainer situation. So
Right.
I think the bottom line is a great agent, a great lender can really help a buyer or even anyone, not just first time, really understand where it's important to spend your money and also kind of get over just the sales price. But let's look at all the other contenders that really go into
Right. I
purchasing
mean,
your home.
I think the overall what you talked to her about and what I talked to her about really kind of educated her on the difference of, oh, I got to stay in this price range
Right.
versus what she could have done by moving just a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. All right. If they want to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
You can call me 972-896-8790.
And you can call us at 214 662 9308.